I have a confession. I think the water temple from Ocarina of Time might not be entirely terrible, and that there's some cool, innovative ideas in there behind a mask of bad design choices. When hearing about the water temple, it can be difficult to tell legitimate criticism from sensationalism online, since the topic has been discussed so much over the past 25 years that I feel like it's become a caricature of itself, with people dismissing the dungeon entirely because of some poor gameplay related and design choices, without considering the positives of the temple. So I offer a different take. Not that the water temple is inherently bad, but rather that some of its flaws were not horrible ideas, but rather were limited by the game's mechanics itself and the console that it was released on, and as a result were poorly executed. I'm not saying that the water temple isn't brutal to play through, because I think it is, and its insistence on being centered around the worst mechanics in Ocarina of Time, as well as the way it punishes backtracking in a pretty complex dungeon, cemented as the least enjoyable dungeon in Ocarina of Time to go through on a first playthrough for me. And as a result of the dungeon's poor design choices, I don't blame anyone from quitting the game because of it. That's what I did the first time I played. You see, the water temple sacrifices free player exploration, the core of what makes Ocarina of Time such an incredible experience, for something worse, all in the name of innovation and complexity. So my plan for this video is to systematically discuss the major flaws of the water temple, those being its heavy reliance on gameplay mechanics that are not fun, the frequent pausing and stoppages that hold player momentum, the unfriendly design towards backtracking in a temple that really needed a reliable way to backtrack, and overall lack of story significance. In the process, I'll be discussing why some of those issues were avoidable and why others weren't, and then come around at the end to praise the high points of the temple because my feelings on the topic are a bit more complex than it's terrible or it's amazing. I actually love most of the ideas, but really dislike the execution almost across the board. So with that being said, I present to you an alternative criticism and a slight defense of the Ocarina of Time water temple. Also, I know many of the issues with this temple were at least somewhat fixed on the 3DS remake, so just to be clear, I'm going to be focusing on the N64 version for this video, because when someone says they hate the water temple, they're talking about the N64 version. So let's start off this discussion of why this temple is significantly flawed with an overview of the temple structure. The water temple is centered around a large tower in the middle of a large chamber that the player needs to gradually ascend to reach the boss of the temple. The player does this by navigating the corridors located on the room's perimeter, collecting keys, altering the water level to ascend or descend to the next level of the temple, and then moving to the next locked door or passage to continue their progress. The player can alter the water level via designated areas throughout the temple, typically at the end of a long corridor or series of rooms, where the player must play Zelda's Lullaby to change the water level, thereby opening up some new rooms and blocking off others in the process. On a conceptual level, this is creative and quite frankly innovative for the Zelda series in 3D. Controlling the water level to make the player able to navigate certain areas while blocking others off sounds like a phenomenal idea for a puzzle-oriented dungeon. However, in reality, this idea is poorly executed because the water temple punishes backtracking more than probably any other dungeon in the entire series. This is because the areas that the player must play the ocarina at to alter the water level are at the end of those aforementioned corridors, and are therefore very inconvenient for the player to access. So for a player to properly experiment with the water levels and understand more about the dungeon layout, they will have to go to the end of these corridors every time and alter the water level. This process offers very little in regards to gameplay other than wasting time for the player. Zelda is supposed to be a series that encourages player experimentation, and while I've criticized the more recent entries in the series for being too free in regards to solving puzzles, this just wastes time because the player knows what they want to try and do. They want to change the water level, but have to spend extra time navigating the long series of rooms to be able to do so. An easy fix would have been to create a shortcut for the player to re-enter these areas once they've gone through the first time around, or even something like a warp to these areas in the central room so they don't waste their time. But it seems Nintendo underestimated how much backtracking most players would need to do the first time playing through this temple. Then you combine the backtracking problem with the issue that all the corridors look really similar because they all have the same textures because this is a Nintendo 64 game, and you end up having a nightmare of a player experience because they'll get lost trying to ever return to where they've previously been. The lack of visual indicators of where things are is a big problem, and that compounded with how necessary backtracking is in the temple the first time around leads to an unintuitive experience. Now, I'm not advocating for something like a glowing red arrow or an objective marker to the proper areas of the temple. Players want to have their intelligence respected, but making the room stand out more geometrically would have made orienting yourself by the minimap so much easier. And since the temple is mostly symmetric, it makes it really easy to get disoriented as a player. So this combination of knowing what you want to do, but not being able to do it because you don't know where you are because the textures and rooms in the central area all look the same, makes the beginning portion of this dungeon pretty terrible overall. I enjoy a good puzzle in a Zelda dungeon, particularly one that can alter the layout and force the player to have to use abstract thinking about the bigger picture, but I don't think this was the temple to start experimenting with this, and due to the dungeon's layout and everything looking the same, the player just gets disoriented, and instead of their brains working overtime to solve a good puzzle like a Rubik's Cube, they end up meandering around aimlessly, wasting a bunch of time in the process, which is just not fun. One of the biggest issues of this temple would have been fixed with something as easy as making a palette swap for the corridor textures on each floor, or even the door textures, just something to make it a little bit easier to know where you are. And again, I like that the temple clearly respects the player at this point, and I like the feeling of getting lost in a dungeon. But the main reason that the temple is difficult isn't because of the complexity of the dungeon, it's because you get lost easily and have to backtrack all the time, which is just bad game design. And I haven't even brought up the actual worst part of this dungeon gameplay-wise, the iron boots and having to pause the game all the time to equip and unequip them. Ocarina of Time's inventory system was just not built for repeatedly opening and closing it. Whether this was due to hardware limitations preventing it from being snappier or just poor design, it doesn't change the fact that it's pretty slow, and everything just takes a bit longer than it ideally should. However, this is to be expected for an older game, and it doesn't really hinder the rest of the game because the player is rarely in the situation where they need to repeatedly swap out items. And I will say that this is the first temple where the player has a real arsenal of items, so just due to the sheer amount of options the player has at their disposal, there's naturally going to be a bit more inventory management in the later dungeons, but not to this extent. The water temple in the earlier portions especially will make the player equip and unequip the iron boots over and over again to get to the end of a particular corridor, taking what probably should have been a 10 to 20 second portion of gameplay in a given room and doubling it. On top of the sheer time wasted here, this is also an immersion killer, which is unfortunate because the water temple's visuals and theme are phenomenal, but issues like this take away from what should be an impressive atmospheric dungeon. This is easily the most common complaint with the water temple, and I think it's 100% valid. However, I would even take it a step further. It's not just the iron boots that are detracting from the immersion, it's all of the random gameplay stoppages that occur in the dungeon. It's the frequent Ocarina of Time usage, the hook shots, the long shot where you have to look around to find where you need to be. All of these are used frequently in the dungeon and are moments where the player isn't really engaging with any action or exploring or fighting, but are just stuck in place doing the particular thing to take them to where they actually want to go to actually be able to do stuff and play the game. Then, it gets even worse when you consider that the player is going to be backtracking down the corridors where they need to dive down and equip the iron boots, only to unequip them again, and then hookshot to a ledge and stop and play the ocarina. This gameplay loop might not seem atrocious at first, but when you realize that every single issue that the water temple has somehow compounds with its other issues, it becomes a real problem that ultimately inconveniences and frustrates the player. Because the reality is that this temple is not that long, and once you get the long shot, it's much more manageable. But the water level adjusting with no real prior context of where to go next is something that the player is going to need to do a lot of experimentation with, and that is made extremely inconvenient for all the reasons I've been describing, but also the unforgiving amount and placement of keys. Some of the keys don't really make much logical sense in terms of the dungeon's progression, and the keys in this dungeon, which block the player's progression at multiple points, are pretty deviously well hidden, meaning that unless you're combing every single room on your first playthrough, you're probably going to miss at least one. In particular, there's the infamous key at the bottom level that the players can miss at the start, which will bottleneck you near the end when you need to unlock a door, but then have to go from the top level to the bottom because you missed it. I did that. And then there's the bombable wall that is also pretty easy to miss in a corridor. So on top of not knowing where you are, not knowing where to go next, having to backtrack along multiple paths with a really unintuitive inventory system, and having to navigate underwater in general, the player also doesn't know where to find the remaining keys, forcing them to go through the whole temple water level progression even more. I understand that a difficulty spike can be nice, and I think that the Forest Temple served well as that spike for players, but expecting kids to finish the water temple by themselves before the age of the internet was a crazy assumption, because I'd like to say around age 10 is probably near the age where someone can really enjoy a game like Ocarina of Time and think outside the box. But the Water Temple is a huge step up from previous dungeons in terms of its mechanical complexity and tedium, and it feels like to me the Zelda team didn't playtest the Water Temple enough because this is just a brutal experience for first timers. Eventually though, after enough struggles and getting through Darklink, who I will be discussing in a little bit as one of the positive sections of the Water Temple, and acquiring the Longshot, you get to the main boss. But who could be this being of destruction that's frozen over Zora's domain? Who could be so devious that they would do such a thing and be waiting at the end of such a brutal temple? Apparently a single-celled organism, Morpha. Morpha is probably the most forgettable boss in the game, and it's almost a slap in the face to the player after getting through an absolutely brutal dungeon experience to even get to the boss room. Morpha just doesn't pose much of a threat to the player at all, but will occasionally pick up the player like the Kraken, which is kind of cool and is probably the only positive thing I can say about the fight. It's kind of like the equivalent of when you're in your room and somehow a wasp gets in there, or a yellow jacket, and you haven't really done anything with them yet. You can technically coexist with it, but you know it's eventually going to be a problem and you have to defeat it. That's kind of what Morpha is like. It just kind of moves around in the water, and the player long shots it to hit it with the sword a few times and defeat it. This boss isn't exactly mechanically sound though, as Morpha's hit detection feels a bit off with the long shot Z targeting sometimes. This is kind of a microcosm of the entire temple though, where you'll go, oh cool, that's neat, but then in reality it's just not that fun. Morpha's relative lack of appeal is magnified even further when considering that this boss comes directly after Phantom Ganon and Volgavia, two fantastic and memorable bosses. Morpha even gets overshadowed by the mini-boss of the temple, which is probably one of the only times in the series that that's ever happened. But, to be positive, I think Morpha's design is really impressive to get working on an N64 with its fluidity and smoothness. It really does look like a fluid, but that doesn't mean it's interesting to look at. Overall, this is just a nothing burger of a fight, which I'm completely torn on. On one hand, when I played it for the first time, I was glad to not have a really difficult fight so I didn't die and have to do the complete temple navigation and Iron Boot shenanigans again. On the other hand, now that I've played it multiple times, I wish it was tougher and more memorable to serve as a cherry on top for a truly infamous dungeon. But once you beat Morpha, you get your sage cutscene with Ruto, who declares her eternal love for you as her husband. I really don't know why Nintendo chose this angle for the Zora Sage, but regardless, it does not hit hard at all. And it's just a bit unfortunate that this temple has very little significant story-wise to go along with the worst gameplay in any of the dungeons. Maybe rivaled by Jabu Jabu's Belly, but once you complete the cutscene and accept your medallion, you emerge from the temple and have your cutscene with Sheik where everything returns to normal, thus ending a truly tragic section of gameplay. I will defend Ocarina of Time, and like to think that it holds up insanely well for a game from 1998, but it's mechanics like this where I really think that the game shows its age. Just super clunky overall, and it really makes me think that Nintendo got overambitious with their temple design. I think that this is pretty clearly the most complex dungeon design in the game, and should have been much more rewarding to explore, but since it punishes backtracking so heavily due to how unfit the temple's concept is towards the rest of the game's mechanics, it ends up being a pretty miserable player experience, but especially the first time you play it. Replaying it allows you to see the ideas it prevents a little bit better. This is why I think the temple has some very vocal fans who appreciate the ideas, atmosphere, and creativity that the temple brought to the table. You see, on repeat playthroughs, you will likely not have to backtrack nearly as much as a first-time player, who has zero context of what the temple is trying to throw at it. Since repeat players will not get bogged down in trying to learn the mechanics of raising and lowering the water level as well as the dungeon layout, they will likely save hours of frustration compared to a first-time player and will therefore be able to appreciate its complexity and ideas more. And in all honesty, if you go through every path properly the first time, it is not a large temple at all. It's just the navigating and making sure you have the right key amount. That's the tough part for new players, and each time you backtrack, it adds a ridiculous amount of time to the dungeon length. It's really cool that you can effectively alter the dungeon layout via player actions, but the temple to take dungeon design to the next level like this should not have been the water temple. It just could not support it with its mechanics, and players don't want to backtrack in an underwater dungeon in the first place, which unfortunately is nearly impossible to avoid for first timers thanks to the unforgiving key placement and the fact that everything looks the same. It's a shame too because, in my opinion, this temple looks incredible. And if you ask me, it looks the most like a classic dungeon out of any of the temples in Ocarina of Time. Looks-wise, its design is one of my favorites in the game. It looks intimidating in a way with its temple-like interior, but also pops with its choice of gold and blue contrasting colors. And also the sheer variety of setting in this dungeon doesn't get brought up enough. They really went all out with the water theme. I love the idea of having an ocean floor at the bottom, then the section with the waterfall that you hookshot up, then the rapid section that you need to avoid getting swept up in, as well as the little stone monuments that you can longshot across. This temple, aside from the corridors that all blend together in the central room, does a really good job of making unique set pieces out of the water theme. And we can't forget the room that you fight Dark Link in either. In my opinion, it's probably the best looking room in the game. It looks almost otherworldly and separated from the rest of the temple, with it just consisting of temple doors, a long passage of shallow, reflective water, and then an oasis with a dead tree. It's just so eerie looking, yet important at the same time, with its contrast from the rest of the temple adding a foreboding atmosphere. And the Dark Link fight is definitely the highlight of the temple. Aside from the obvious frustration that this temple causes, this is definitely the standout part. The setting is just incredible, and Dark Link is a nice callback to his appearance in The Adventure of Link where he's the final boss. In addition, he's a tougher boss battle than most mini-bosses, so he stands out even more. He's also the only one to jump on your sword and do a backflip off of it too, so there's that. Unfortunately, he gets cheesed by the Megaton Hammer, which I think is actually a neat mechanic and rewarding to player experimentation, but if you ignore that or didn't know that, he serves as a long, really cool fight. It's important to know as well that Dark Link is scaled difficulty-wise to the player's max heart count, which makes him the only enemy in the game to difficulty scale, which is really cool. So for players doing a 3-heart challenge, Dark Link goes down very quickly, but for completionists he will likely take a while. I also think that after the Dark Link fight, the temple just becomes a lot less insufferable overall, with the main idea shifting from the iron boots and water level shifting to navigating vortexes and water currents. They include a block puzzle in the second part though, just to make sure that the player wasn't having too much fun. But even the second part of this temple can't make up for how unfortunate the beginning is. I really do want to like the Water Temple for its amazing atmosphere, music, set pieces, and even some of the puzzles presented, but I just can't because of how tedious everything is in execution. My gripes with the Water Temple are almost entirely gameplay related, and not necessarily its ideas. It's crazy too because I love Ocarina of Time's gameplay otherwise, and in theory, the Water Temple's design, but the frequent pauses, stoppages, necessary yet inconvenient backtracking, and questionable design choices across the board make it hard to do the things you want to do in the temple, leading to less puzzle solving and more inventory management. The inconvenience of navigating this dungeon makes my feelings on it overall very mixed. And while I can't say it's the worst thing I've experienced in a video game, considering how good the rest of Ocarina of Time is across the board, the Water Temple sticks out like a sore thumb gameplay-wise. And the first time I played Ocarina of Time, I had to put the game down for a long time because of it, which I know I'm not alone in. But again, I can't say that I entirely dislike it or that it's one of the worst moments I've experienced in gaming, and the 3DS remake fixes most of the issues with this dungeon anyways, so there's alternative options to the original experience. However, for a first-time player, this is absolutely brutal. Ultimately though, it really comes down to what you value in a dungeon. If you're someone who loves a really difficult challenge, then the Water Temple is probably the only one in this game to really get tricky in terms of difficulty. And if you can look past the mechanical issues to see how innovative the temple's design was, or just really like the aesthetic, or just really like replaying the game, then this is also probably the one for you. But if you're more like me, and you value your time and enjoyment and story significance in your dungeons, then you probably dislike it. Its ideas are compelling, yet poorly executed. It's probably the temple that you'll end up spending the most time in, but not because there's a lot of rooms. It has a cool boss, but not the main one. It has obvious flaws, but some would say that they're a part of the experience. These reasons are why I think the Water Temple is so polarizing and therefore worth a second look. So, is the Water Temple fun? I would say no. I don't want to play it, especially on the N64 version, but I can appreciate it from a distance and understand that its concept was super creative, and had the inventory been a little bit smoother and had been on a console where texture reuse wasn't so necessary, then it could have been a very strong temple. However, I never want to play it again personally, and it made me put down one of my favorite games for years before actually coming back to it, and that's unforgivable. And because of its poor design choices, the Water Temple ends up with a very interesting legacy, overshadowing some otherwise fantastic moments with its flaws. I think that dismissing the Water Temple entirely would just be missing out on some great stuff, but I can also agree that the experience is severely flawed in multiple areas, so that leads us to the true legacy of the Ocarina of Time Water Temple, Not as the best temple or the worst in the series, but undoubtedly the most polarizing temple in the series.